Good morning, everyone. I'm Anu. This is Browntown Games. A while ago, I told my wife I was going to paint a model for her, and she had 2 words for me. She said, Baby Yoda. So, I painted her, this, Baby Yoda, and Mandalorian diorama. In this video, I'll show you how I put everything together from the base to painting the Mandalorian and painting Baby Yoda. So stick around and watch all the awesomeness. Am I hamming this up for this video on the Mandalorian release? No, not a chance. Prepping the model. So I snap some small pieces of paper clip off and put a tiny dab of super glue and attach it to the bottom of both the Baby Yoda and the Mandalorian. Here I'm putting a pilot hole in with my snippers and then screwing that hole a little bit deeper so I can pin the paper clip to the bottom of Mando's foot. I'm just putting a tiny dab so I can snap it off afterwards. Now I'm taking a base. This is a 90mm regular GW base, and I have some pieces of cork, or bark rather, that I found from local hikes around my area, and just figuring out where I want to put these rock formations behind where Mando and Baby Yoda are going to stand. So once I'm happy, like I am here, I'll add a piece to the top as well. So once I'm happy, I'll take some super glue and put them in place. I usually use a healthy amount of super glue when I'm putting bark onto a base, so make sure that you have a well ventilated area or some windows open so you don't get high off super glue. After everything's dried and the pieces are in place, I take some Vallejo rough ground texture and I liberally apply it to the entire base, including the rock formations at the back. Baby Yoda. So starting with on Baby Yoda's pod, I give it a base coat of bright warm gray. All of the paints I'll be using in this video, -1, are from Monument Hobbies Pro Acryl line. And following that, I paint his blanket that's behind him in dark umber. Now I'm base coating his skin black green, and his sweater I've painted with light umber. Now here I'm creating a wash with transparent brown, so it's heavily diluted, and then I'm putting it all over his pod. I've also pin washed his pod with coal black just to catch the edges. Now I'm going back in with that bright warm gray and catching some of the edges, as well as the buttons on the front. And catching the edges here again. So now I'm taking dark warm gray and I'm stippling scratch marks that you can see on his pod all over, and I'm trying to be as random as possible, so I'm randomly selecting spots and stippling in a quicker fashion. If you do this in a slower fashion, you're going to end up having similar patterns throughout the entire pod, so work fast and your scratches and dents will look a little more natural. Now on his sweater here, I stipple some golden brown mixed with ivory, probably 50-50 or 3 parts ivory, 1 part golden brown. I wanted it to be a fair bit lighter but still have that brown look. And so I'm using a tiny brush and basically stippling over the entire fabric. Now I go in with a highlight of pure ivory, and again the same stippling pattern here, just catching the most raised edges on the front of his sweater that are going to be facing out. And after that, now I'm taking green and layering that over his entire skin. The black green that we applied before was essentially just to bring it into that green spectrum as a base to work with. Now I'm using some bright pale green, and I'm using that as the highlight for all of his raised areas. So similar to any way that you would paint a normal face, I'm catching the eyebrows, forehead, nose, and cheekbones, as well as the tops of his giant ears. And then on the top of his head and into the back of his head, he's got these bumps. So I'm taking that bright pale green and putting those bumps in on his head. And then going back through again and increasing the opacity. Now this is the most important step, so I'm taking a glaze of that bright pale green and green mix and glazing it into in between those spots on his head and in between the parts of his face and ears that are that darker green. So it's all going to bring it into that brighter green spectrum while still giving you the highlights and a little bit of shade. As you can see here on the top of his head, it's all sort of blending in and there aren't stark transitions. Now to highlight his blanket, I'm just taking swiping motions with light umber and going over all of the raised areas, so it adds a little bit of texture to his blanket. Hey, if you're enjoying this, press that like button and subscribe to the channel so you can keep up with all the other videos that I'll be producing in the future. Thanks so much. Painting Mando. Now we're starting with a base coat of dark warm gray over all of his trousers, his shirt, and sleeves for his arms. You might want to go through twice and do this. I should also note that both models and the base are primed using Stynylrez primer from Badger and black Stynylrez primer. So here now I'm starting to work on his leg armor. I'm doing a base of burnt red over all of the panels that will be red. You can see I'm painting the right leg armor here red as well. I ultimately end up changing that and having it more of a yellow look, but I'll go into that a bit later. So I'm painting his chest piece as well, which is red. And all of this is base coated in burnt red again. And the shoulder panel, which I ultimately end up changing. As well as his other shoulder panel. Now for his cloak, I wanted a smooth blend between dark umber and light umber, so using pretty undiluted paint here, just a moist brush, grabbing it straight out of the pot. I'm taking some dark umber, putting it into the recessed areas of the cloak, grabbing a bit of light umber, and then putting the putting it on the raised areas of the cloak and sort of messily mashing the colors in between each other to create a semi-smooth blend. I'll go back through and I'll reinforce the lighter areas and darker areas, and I'm going to go through this process 2 or 3 times before I'm happy with the results that I have. If what you end up painting isn't perfectly smooth, that's okay. We're going to address that a bit later. And now I'm taking that same dark umber and painting his gloves as well. All of the leather bits, including his boots and gun holster, as you can see here, are all going to be base coated in that dark umber. Now we're going to the metallics. For his metallics, I used silver metallic paint by Monument Pro Acryl. Super smooth in its transitions. I also applied it to all of his buckles that would be metal and all of the gun casings, and finally used it as a base coat for his helmet. With his helmet, you want to be really careful that you don't catch the black parts on the inside. Now here I mix some transparent black in with that silver metallic and am glazing into the darker recesses of the areas that wouldn't be attracting light. I used a photo of Mando that I pulled up off Google as a reference for which areas I would want in shadow and which areas I would want highlighted. And here again, just taking some of that transparent black mixed with the silver metallic. Now, because the ground is going to be more of a reddy texture, I take that metallic silver, add a little bit of transparent red to it, and now I'm glazing that into those recessed areas that are going to be facing down. Because those would be reflecting some of the red off of his armor as well as some of the red on the ground. And then I take some transparent blue, a very tiny bit, and add it into that metallic silver, and I start putting that on the raised areas, so the top of his helmet and any raised edges that would be facing the sky. And now just taking some pure silver metallic again, actually taking some metallic medium, which is the brightest color that they have, and reinforcing the highest edges and smoothing that blend a little bit for the most raised areas that are just going to be pure shine. Now I'm highlighting the red areas with bold Pyrrole Red, just doing a very slight catch of those areas. I'm going to end up taking that burnt red as well as some dark golden brown and glaze back into those reds again and really darken them down. And with his boots here, I'm highlighting those with light umber. In terms of the boots, I wasn't too worried about highlighting them because they're going to be blended into the ground anyways. Now for his cloth, I wanted it to have that tan look. So I took some golden brown and added some ivory to it and am stippling that over the raised areas of all of his cloth. As you can see here, I'm building opacity. This took me a few layers to get it to the color that I wanted it to be, but overall it ends up looking pretty good. And now with the gun stock on the back, I painted that in light umber, and now I'm just going in with some olive flesh and catching the edges and making some micro scratches to simulate the wood grain. I'm taking that same olive flesh and I'll be adding highlights to his gloves and the different leather areas. And on his gloves, his fingers are orange, so I go back and paint those orange. And now here I'm taking a wash of transparent brown and putting it all over the boots and the leather areas. So that'll tone down that olive flesh highlight and bring everything back into that brown spectrum, which will give you a really good leather look. Now while that's drying, with this cloak, I take some light umber and reinforce the raised area. So I'm taking a swiping motion, simulating some texture on that cloth, and I'm putting it over the entirety of the cloth. And I've mixed some olive flesh into this as well to really boost that contrast and vibrancy. And then I'll take that same transparent brown wash and I will put it over the cloak, and similar to the leathers on the boots, this will tone everything down into that brown spectrum again. Now I'm taking some of that silver metallic that was used previously and creating the rough textures on all of the metals. So all of the shoulder pads and any area of metal that would have battle damage to it, I'm similar to Baby Yoda's pod, just randomly adding micro textures and battle damage to these spots. And then here I'm highlighting all of the gray areas. So I'm taking the light warm gray and just catching all of the raised areas of the gray parts of his pants and his sleeves on his arms. And the sleeves, as you can see here and here. After that, I'm going to take some transparent black, put it into a wash consistency, and put it over all of the gray parts. And that is Mando. Now to the base. So I've primed the base in black by Stynylrez or by Badger Stynylrez, and am base coating all of the Martian Earth areas in Mahogany. This is a really nice, deep, rich browny red. So the ground is all in Mahogany, as well as the bottom of the rocks I've also based in Mahogany. Then I'm going to take some of the dark warm gray and put it over the tops of the rocks. I'm also going to focus on blending that Mahogany mix. And then I'm going to take some burnt red and sort of overbrush that base. I'm trying not to catch the rocks with this. And now I'm taking some olive flesh and doing a dry brush of that entire base, or that bottom base area, not including the rocks. With the rocks, I'm going to do a dry brush of warm gray, or bright warm gray. This has a little bit of a greenish tinge to it, which will be nice. I'm not being very light-handed with this. I'm being pretty heavy with it because I'm going over the entire base now with a wash of with a mix of transparent red, transparent brown, and transparent black. So all of those mixed together, and I'm washing it over the entire base. And after that wash is dried, I'm going to take that olive flesh again and do a very light dry brush over the entire base, including the rocks. And now, after spraying the base with Tester's Dull Coat and gluing the models on, I have some Mars dust and sand pigments from Huge Minis. I open those up, and while the varnish is still wet, I take an old cruddy brush and just start applying it onto the base. So with the Mars dust, I want to focus on the deeper, darker areas of the ground. So I'm putting those in, dabbing that on, and then brushing it in towards the center. I take that sand pigment and I'm putting it more towards the front and middle of the base and blending the two pigments together. I'm also taking some of that Mars pigment and putting it over the rocks. And I end up doing this a couple times to really build the opacity there. And once after you've applied the pigments, using a downwards brush stroke, just tap any or brush any of the extra pigment off and allow it to dry. And there we go. Once that's all dried, here is our completed Mandalorian base. Now the Baby Yoda, I super glued to his cloak so that it would be suspended and have that awesome free floating look to it. And the yellowish armors, with that same red base that I had, I just glazed over some yellow ochre and some ice yellow to the top areas, and then some golden, dark and light golden brown glazes into the lower areas or the recessed areas to give it that yellowy brown look. And that's how it all came together. For more pictures of this diorama, please check out my Instagram account at Browntown Games. Thanks for popping in and watching this video. If you liked what you saw, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to keep up with all the new content. Thanks.